Hello, back row.
Hello, front row.
Oh, all right. Tonight, just some questions. Maybe you'll have one as we go through it. We'll try and answer. And maybe something will if something comes to your mind doing this, feel free to speak up. I may not have an answer to that. So some of these are on the book of James or about him, and then a couple others are not. To me, they're all interesting, and like I said, this will be the last night we'll meet. We'll take the month of July off. We'll come back in August, and I'll probably start in 1 John. So, okay? All right, questions. First one. What was James's relationship with the church in Jerusalem? Well, it's where he ended up living, and he becomes the head of the church, or lead pastor would be how we'd know him, after the apostles left and spread as persecution rose. Of course, James, John's brother, was persecuted, and then shortly thereafter, Peter was arrested, and so they started to spread out. Acts 12:17 says, but this is Peter motioning to them with his hand, be silent. He described to them how the Lord had led him out of prison, and he said, report these things to James and the brethren. And in Acts 21:18, the following day, Paul went with us, this would be Luke writing, to James, and all the elders were present. So James rises to become like the head pastor, if you will, of the church in Jerusalem after its start. Now, I don't know how many years from the time of Pentecost forward. Maybe it was a couple years, probably more about 5 or 6 before he rises up to be head pastor. Best way I know how to describe it. Second question, what was James's leadership in selecting different books of the Bible? He had no input in selecting any of the books. But as I go through, I'll answer a few more questions and tell you who did have some input in that. He just wrote one that is in there. Third question is, I would assume the disciples who wrote the scriptures, says, how could they pay for the papyrus and for the writer, as Paul has some do the writing for him, or Luke did the writing? They were poor and probably could not write. Well, yeah, they were poor, but they were supported by others and made contributions to them. Plus, Paul, he worked as a tent maker. Peter, James, John, they were fishermen, and they would go back fishing it from time to time whenever needed. You go into the Old Testament, Jeremiah talks about him purchasing land. See, the Bible only tells us what it wants us to know. It doesn't give us a 24-hour a day, John gets up and punches into to work and, works his 8 hours and come home and then, goes out and does this. So we don't know everything that they did, but we do know that people, some of them worked, and then others made contributions. You got Luke 8:3. Joanna, Susanna, and others were contributing to their, referring to Jesus and the apostles' support out of their own private means, by what money they had. John 13:29, for some were supposing Judas had a money box. And John 12:6, talking about Judas, he wasn't concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, he had the money box. So the only reason that they had a money box is people were making contributions to their support. And that was often in Jesus' day, he was considered a teacher, and he had students, and the students or families were to pay the teacher. That's how they would make the support. Well, Jesus wasn't charging, but he made, or people made, contributions to him. Lazarus was considered to have been probably fairly well-to-do and one of the greater supporters of Jesus and his ministry. I would assume the same was true for the apostles after they spread out, that people took and gave them support. Paul, in his letter to Rome, or to the Romans, one of his hopes was that he would go there and they would help support him go to Spain. That was his desire, to go to Spain. Of course, he went to Rome, just not the way he intended. Anybody got any follow-up questions on that? Any of those?
I was just thinking about Dot. The writings are so intellectual. So how can these, I still think they were poor.
Well, they were poor because in that day and age, either you were rich or poor. It was one or the other. But James and John, their father Zebedee is believed to have had a fishing business that Peter and Andrew worked for. And so he would have been fairly well-to-do. Plus, John was able to go into the high priest housing complex, and you got to be able to rub elbows in order to be able to do that. The majority of them were poor, even probably by today's standard. But like I said, they worked. And it's not like today's standard where you go to buy a pack of paper and what was $1 last year is $3 this year. You know, some of them made their own paper, but I suspect most of them, they could barter. They would, they earned money doing whatever they did, and bought the paper to write it down. Now you have to understand, especially in the New Testament times, they were. Jeremiah thought, I suspect most of them, the paper to write down. You have to understand, especially. They were. They were smart people. I want to say educated, not like college education, like Paul. Now Paul was very well educated for his time, but Paul spoke Greek. He spoke Aramaic, which Jesus probably spoke because that was the language of that area, and Paul also spoke Hebrew. So Paul knew 3 languages. Anybody here know 2 languages? Anybody like me that can struggle with English? That's me. But a lot of them, because Greek was the trade language, so it's possible Peter, Andrew, James, John all spoke some Greek as they sold the fish. Even others, possible. Now Luke was, of course, a physician. He was highly educated. So as far as them being able to buy, it was a different time and different manner. But like I said, they worked or people contributed to them, which would have enabled them to take and purchase stuff. But for all Jewish boys, I'm trying to remember the ages, they would go to school from like age 4 or 5 till about age 10, it's like 5 years. They were taught to read and write, boys. And they were supposed to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible. Anybody here got a book memorized? Book of Jude, maybe, that's 17 verses or so. So that was part of their education. In order to memorize, you need to be able to read some, at least. And so they were smarter than what you might think. Next question then. What's the difference between an apostle and a disciple? You look at the 2 words in Greek. The apostle from the Greek is apostolos, which means in English, one who is sent or sent out. So an apostle in the biblical sense is one who rose to a position of authority and that Jesus sent out to carry out his message. They became leaders in the church. Now, Barnabas, Paul, Timothy, Silas, James, the half-brother of Jesus, Apollos, Matthias, were all considered apostles, not just the original 12. A disciple is a follower of Christ. The meaning is a learner or a pupil. You can think of a disciple as one who was a student of Christ. So essentially, we're all disciples of Christ. We're all students. We're not sitting at his feet, but we learn from his word. The 12 apostles were disciples. They just had the more intimate teachings. But you think about Matthias, the qualification for the replacement for Judas was you have to have followed Jesus the entire time, or the majority of his teaching time. And he had people who followed him everywhere. They didn't have the intimate times of teaching like the 12 did. So you've got an apostles who are ones who are sent out. They've got the message. They've been called by God. I mean, Paul was called by Jesus himself, but they're sent out to go and share the message, the gospel. A disciple would maybe sit under the apostles, or they certainly were under, even following Jesus when they first began. Make sense? Kind of, sort of, maybe? Clear as mud? Okay.
How does an apostle and a missionary differ? A missionary is sent out.
Well, apostle begins with a name, missionary with an M. How about that?
Okay. Got that.
In that day, they were called apostles. They didn't call them missionaries. I can see, if you look at the spiritual gift of apostleship, which is a person who starts new things, whether it's starting a new church, starting a new ministry, whether it's an entirely new organization, or even just starting a ministry within a church, they might have that gift of apostleship. I can see missionaries having that gift. And in a way, yeah, they are apostles. They're sent out by a church or by an organization, but mostly sent out by God. Yeah, which some of them are sent to places that we don't even want to think about. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Did they not all pool resources for the good of the community to work together and feed the groups?
Once the church got started, that's one thing you see in Acts chapter 2, is they, like Barnabas, he sold a piece of property and gave it basically to the church to use as needed, not to, pad the pockets of Peter and Andrew and so forth, but widows or this one or that one, whatever the need was. And kind of like mission work that we might do locally is what they did. And so that church could become a rich church overnight if enough people did it. But it says they all worked together. They were unified for that purpose. It wasn't about self. It was about sharing the gospel, taking it out. Anybody else?
There was a couple during this time, they lied.
Ananias and Sapphira. Yeah. They sold a piece of property and brought a portion of it to the church and said, this is the full amount. But it wasn't the full amount. And God says, no lie. Yeah, because, can you imagine if God had done nothing, other people would have found out that they lied, well then it would just spread. And so, oh yeah, I'm giving $100 a week. That's 10% of my pay. But maybe they're making $2,000 a week, and it's 5% or 1% or whatever the case may be. It would have damaged the church greatly. Plus the reputation throughout the community, it would have damaged that reputation if God had not addressed that very drastically, because that was probably within the first year of Pentecost in the church there. Anybody else? Fifth question is, were the books in the Bible written before the fall of the temple in 70 AD? All right, well, the Old Testament was. The books of the Old Testament were, and I know I address this again in the next question a little bit, were closed or completed, considered canonized in the city of Jamnia, which is on the Mediterranean Sea coast, by rabbis, learned men of the scriptures, somewhere between 70 AD and 135 AD. So it had been after the destruction of Jerusalem, which was 70 AD, and the Romans did that in 70 AD. As for the New Testament, there were books that were written before 70 AD, which would include James, which is believed to have been the first written of the New Testament, somewhere between 45 and 50 AD. Matthew and Mark are considered somewhere in the 50s, early 60s AD. Luke was 60 AD and Acts 61 AD, both same author. Paul's letters were written between 49 and 67 AD, and 1st and 2nd Peter 63, 66 AD. So all before 70 AD. Now, books written after the fall of Jerusalem, but no mention of it is in there because really one of the purpose is Jude, 70 to 80 AD, and then the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. John's writings were 85 to 90, and then Revelation would have been in the late 90s. So really, it's mainly John's writings are the only ones that were written after the fall of Jerusalem or destruction. Would probably been a better choice as the Romans destroyed it. The next one, kind of a follow-up, is what is the canon of the scriptures? Well, the English word canon comes from the Greek word that means rule or a measuring stick. So the word then came to mean rule or standard. Canon came to mean rule or standard. By the 4th century, it came to refer to the list of books that constituted the Old and New Testaments. That's why it's called a canon. The Old Testament is a canon and New Testament's canon. So to be canonized is the process by which the books of the Bible were discovered as authoritative. There are other biblical books. The Catholic Bible is probably the best example. You've heard of the Apocrypha? Yes, no, maybe? No. Now go find your Catholic Bible and they'll be in the middle. They are biblical time writings. The Catholic Church says they belong in the Bible, but only the Catholic Church. The others said no, they do not belong in there. So canonization is when there's said they are authoritative books. Men did not canonize the scripture. Men simply recognized the authority of the books that God inspired. So some books were declared to not be a part of the canon. And this is what the Apocrypha is. Tobias, I think, is one of the books. I think there's like a 2nd and a 3rd Ezra that are in the Apocrypha. If you go to the internet, you can Google the Apocrypha if you can spell it. But it will give you the books that are there. The Jewish Tanakh is known as the Hebrew Bible, which contains 24 books that are divided into 3 parts. The first 5, which would be Genesis through Deuteronomy, is known as the Torah, or the teaching. The 8 books of the Nevi'im, or prophets, and 11 books of the writings is composed mainly in biblical Hebrew. A portion of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Now the Greek Septuagint, which is a translation of the Hebrew into Greek, closer resembles the Hebrew Bible, but includes additional text and is the main textual source for our Christian Bible today, or at least the Old Testament. The first part of the Christian Bible is the Old Testament. Of course, that contains a minimum of 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, but it's been divided into 39 books. Well, how does 24 turn to 39? Well, we have 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. In the Hebrew Bible, it's Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. As we get into, some say Ezra and Nehemiah, one book, not two separate books. And so what the Hebrew might have as one, we might have as two books or even more. In fact, I don't know if Joshua and Judges would along that line. All right? Who selected the writings for the Bible? It's kind of a follow-up to, I think, the first question. Well, the Old Testament books were selected by a meeting of the Jewish rabbis in Jamnia, a coastal city in Israel on the Mediterranean. They set the books of the Hebrew Bible, and of course, the Hebrew Bible has a different number than our Old Testament would have. Same books. As I said, that was done somewhere between 70 and 135 AD when they canonized that as being complete. The New Testament books were recognized as authoritative and complete at the Third Council of Carthage. They had a number of councils from the 100 forward. But in Third Council of Carthage in 397 AD. Now, Carthage is, I think, in northern Africa. Used to be Egypt, and all along the northern coast of Africa was very Christian until the, I want to say Mormons, but Muslims come through and took over most of it. It was a group of learned Christian men that recognized the 27 books of the New Testament as authoritative. Closed. No more word from God. It has been the same since for Western churches. You've heard of Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. They might disclude one or add something different because they had their own council, so to speak, that they canonized. Qualifications for a book of the New Testament, from what I have gathered over time, is either an apostle wrote it or one of their students, disciples, wrote it. Luke, Senator Paul, he wrote the Gospel of Luke and Acts. Mark is believed to have been either Peter's understudy or Peter's son. And of course, he wrote the Gospel of Mark. Now, Matthew was an apostle. He wrote his. John wrote his. Paul, all the letters he wrote. James is considered to be an apostle. Jude is also evidently rose up in the church and was considered an apostle for his to be included in there. So that's how those two came to be together, or who decided what goes in it. Now, like I said, Hebrew Bible, of course, that's just Old Testament. The order of their books are different. In fact, if I remember correctly, the Hebrew Bible, now our last book in the Old Testament is Malachi. Their last book is Chronicles. It's how they said it needs to be. But they also have the law, the prophets, and the writings, 3 sections. And you'll see Jesus refers to the law and the prophets numerous times. In a few occasions, law, prophets, and writings. So that's how they divide. Now, the New Testament, like I said, well, Catholic Church, it says, oh, the Apocrypha, they have a third section, Old Testament, New Testament, and Apocrypha, which is kind of a in-between, is what they call it, writings, between the time the Old Testament, Malachi is finished, and the writing of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and so forth. Next, question 8. Who was James Zebedee? Was he Jesus' half-brother? Well, James was the son of Zebedee, who was the brother of John. They were both apostles, known as the sons of thunder. Both were fishermen. Now, James, the half-brother of Jesus, became the leader of the church there in Jerusalem. We already talked about it and looked at his book. And then who was Judas that wrote the book of Jude, one of the shorter books of the Bible and located right before Revelation? Well, Jude was a half-brother of Jesus, full-blood brother of James. Evidently, he did not become a believer until after Christ's resurrection, like James, his brother, did. We see in Matthew 13:55, people say, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" referring to Jesus. "Is that not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas?" Which shorten, like we shorten names, Jude, Judas or Jude. And you can see pretty much the same thing in Mark 6:3. "Is this not his brother James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon?" And of course, he had sisters as well. Last question I have concerns the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Anybody read the Dead Sea Scrolls? No. The question is, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by whom? Well, it was in 1946, beginning then, that nearly 900 scrolls were discovered and are referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of them are written on parchment. Some were written on papyrus. They are a large collection of thousands of written fragments of biblical and extra-biblical manuscripts that were discovered in caves by shepherd boys and in buildings near the western shoreline of the Dead Sea, hence Dead Sea Scrolls. It's believed that a group of Jews known as the Essenes are the ones who placed them there as they lived there in seclusion for a pretty good amount of time on that mountainous type caves there on the western part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Dead Sea, excuse me. Now, Essenes, if you recall from the New Testament, Jesus often argued with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's another group known as the Herodians, because they backed Herod. And then you had your Essenes. You could think of them as religious parties or, in some ways, political groups. Pharisees were the strongest and most numerous. Then came your Sadducees, and then the Herodians. Essenes were a small group that they had all these copies of the Old Testament scriptures plus other extra biblical copies, and so they read them. They had them amongst themselves. They were stored in clay jars, from what I understand. Now, over time, jars might crack or weather or animals or whatever after they long left. But can you imagine? This would have been from the 1st century, and were not found until the 1900s. Let's see. The copies are of the Hebrew Scriptures and, like I said, other extra writings written before the birth of Christ. So you're talking about BC times. Approximately 40% are scrolls of the Old Testament. A small number of well-preserved, almost intact manuscripts survive. The remaining are partial manuscripts. So, you imagine, something that's a few thousand years old, they don't have, they have a full sheet. Of course, this is on scrolls, they're rolled up. So the inner part, if bugs got on the inner part, well, that part's gone. Or if they started on the outside, then that part's gone. They had a few that were totally intact or all, but just maybe a small section. Researchers have assembled a collection of 981 different manuscripts discovered from 1946, 47, and in 1956 from 11 different caves in the same vicinity. Now, due to the poor condition of some of the scrolls, scholars have not identified all of the text. So they got some, they don't even know what it is. They can't tell. It'd be like every fifth letter is readable. You know, it'd be kind of hard to tell what it, I don't even know how they could tell it if they had all of them, as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not a linguist. The identified texts fall into three general groups. One, about 40% of the copies are texts from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. Two, approximately another 30% are texts from the Second Temple period, Ezra, that time. Ultimately, were not canonized in the Hebrew Bible, like there's the Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees, Book of Tobit, Wisdom of Sirach, and then Psalms, and I didn't know this, Psalm 152 through 155. I thought it stopped at 150. And then they have others that fall in that. So that's the second category. The third, which is about 30%, are secretary manuscripts of previously unknown documents that shed light on the rules and beliefs of a particular group, sect, or group within Judaism, like the community rule, the war scroll, Pesher on Habakkuk, which would be like a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, and the rule of life. So there's so many other books. I remember you read through the Old Testament, especially in Kings and Chronicles, when they're talking about the kings, and it says, you know, he died, and the rest about him is written in this book and this book and this book. Well, they're not a book in the Bible, but it is an extracurricular biblical era writing. I won't say book, but it's not. So the 39 books of the Hebrew Bible are all represented by at least a single fragment. It'd be like having one verse out of the book of Habakkuk, except for Esther. They do not have any for Esther. And possibly a separate book of Nehemiah, but it might be combined as Ezra and Nehemiah. So that answers my questions that I was given, and I thank you for them. Anybody else? Anything along that line?
What
That maybe,
again were they stored in?
I'm sorry?
What, you said they were stored in
Like clay pots.
clay, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay.
So, you know, and it was just in a cave, so I can imagine a big windstorm coming through and blowing down that cave and knocking one into the other, cracking it. Well, then it's exposed to the elements, or at least to air. But a lot of the clay pots, from what I understand, were sealed pretty good. And so that's where they had the more complete manuscripts from that. But it was like 11 different caves that they found them in. So, anybody?
We went to, a group of us went to High Point at the mall, and in one of the original stores, they had Dead Sea Scrolls there.
They displayed them in High Point at one time.
I remember hearing when they came through, been not too long ago, but a few years ago, if I remember right. Yeah, you had, if it was the original, they were in vacuum sealed containers or copies.
Well, you couldn't touch it. It was
No.
behind glass.
No.
And it looked like leather. Dark
Yeah,
leather.
that I think is what's known as papyrus hide, where they take it and get it down and they wrote on that. I think that's papyrus, or is papyrus the grass? Have to go back and check. But yeah, there was a certain plant that grew in the Nile that they would make into paper. They would take animal hide and write on that. And I mean, they had different like roots that they made ink from, and kind of like the old way the papers of 1700s, you know, how they dip that quill in the ink and write. That's about how they wrote back then. Only difference, I don't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, how accurate they were, but anything, well, they probably would have been accurate too. It's, in the Hebrew, they were so afraid to mess it up that in writing, if there was 11 letters, of course they went right to left in Hebrew. If there was 11 letters in this line, when they copied it, it had better be room for only 11 letters. If, you know, 12 lines, then it needs to be 12 lines. Because, you know, on a scroll, it was like for us putting it on a copy machine and hitting copy, that's how they wanted it to be. Which is why this has been preserved for as long as it has been. Because the scribes, as they're referred to, copied it letter for letter, space for space. Now, you know what makes the Hebrew language, or made it so hard to understand, to read? No vowels. Could you read English with no vowels? And to make it even harder, no spaces between the words. So it just been, you know, I had a headache within 30 seconds. But they were that precise, and they knew it. So, and that was good. Now, the other point I would make is, you know, like I said, there are many copies of Old and many more of New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls are just one, but they are considered to be the oldest copies of the Old Testament known. And of course, what they did, they take what they had, the oldest, and they compared it to the newest. And like I said, line for line, letter for letter. There were a few differences, but it was like instead of the word A-N-D, and, it was an, A-N. Or a period instead of a comma, or a comma instead of a period type. Minimal difference. It did not change the meaning of the text at all. It was that accurate. You're going back to Dead Sea Scrolls written in BC times, and they have copies that go into the 200s, 300s of the Old Testament that were copied from previous. And so when they compare them, no difference. Now tell me that God isn't behind that. There are other writings. One that I keep hearing is known as the Gilgamesh Epic, which parallels the story of Noah and the flood. But if they have 5 copies, each one's a little bit different. And so it changed over time. Anybody else?
You mentioned a lot of books. Is there a book called the Book of the Maccabees?
Yes, I think that's one of the Apocrypha.
Oh, is it? Okay. Because it's more historical, isn't it?
Well, I mean, Ezra and Nehemiah is historical. The Maccabees is the period between the Old and the New Testament, and before Rome took over. And of course, when Rome, came along, they were the world power. The Greeks had been in control of the Middle East. There was no more Israel, not since really Babylon. Persia let them come back, but it was still under their rule. And then the Greeks come along, and they're in control. And, well, some of the Greek rulers did some things that really offended the Jews, and the Jews just didn't like being ruled by anybody. And so family by the name of Maccabee. Basically led a couple of wars and battles, and for maybe a half a dozen to a dozen years, they ruled Israel. It wasn't ruled by the Greeks, it wasn't ruled by the Romans, it wasn't ruled by Babylonians or Persians or anybody else. They ruled themselves for like 6 to about a dozen years. And the Maccabees were like that. And the story I remember reading, I can't remember his first name, one of the Maccabees, he rode into Jerusalem on a big stallion. And the people covered the road honoring him. Red carpet treatment. Jesus rides in, same road, gets the same treatment, but he's riding on a donkey.
Apotheka. Now, did you say that was in the Catholic Bible?
Yes, the Apocrypha is what they call, or like the third section of the Bible. We have the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament.
And so they drew their writing from the Maccabees?
No, the Maccabees is a book in the Apocrypha. They had their own council and looked at all these other extra biblical writings and said, this belongs in the Bible. Where the Protestant church said, no, it doesn't. There's a book out there known as the Gospel of Thomas. It's not in our Bible because it's not considered to have been written by the original Thomas. It was, somebody just put it down because it might give it a little more credibility. Like I said, there are other writings that are out there that are known to have been first century BC, first century AD, second century, but when they met, like I say, it was 397 AD, they said, okay, it's closed, there's no more writings, all the apostles are dead, all their students are dead, there's nothing else. And so, others tried to sneak some in, but it was a group of learned men that said, this is it. I know, I think it was Clement was his name, early church father. It said that he was a student of John the Apostle. John didn't die until late 90s AD, so Clement would have been somewhere in the 100s. And then Clement had, this student, and it went on for a few hundred years. But they determined, like I said, that you either had to be an apostle or a disciple, student of an apostle, for your writing to be considered an entry into the New Testament. Anybody else? Guess not. I hope you learned a little something. And so we'll go have a little prayer time here. And whoever's watching, good night, and thank you for tuning in. Join.